The morning Augusta Hurst stared down the barrel of a lawman's rifle, she had exactly three things working in her favor: a legitimate bill of sale tucked inside her coat, a temper sharper than a Bowie knife, and the stubborn refusal to be intimidated by any man breathing dust on her land. The sun had barely crested the red clay hills east of Caldwell, Kansas, that October morning in 1878 when she heard the horses. She had been up since before dawn, the way she always was, moving through the dark barn with a lantern in one hand and a grain bucket in the other, checking on the new cattle she had driven in from the Dawson Ranch 2 days prior. 14 head of prime Hereford stock, every one of them purchased fair and square with money she had scraped together over 3 years of working a homestead alone. She had the paper to prove it, signed by old Clem Dawson himself and witnessed by his foreman, a reliable man named Pete Alcott who had been ranching that territory since before the war. Augusta was 26 years old. With dark auburn hair, she kept pinned severely at the nape of her neck, calloused hands that told the full story of her life, and green eyes so direct that men who met her for the first time often forgot what they had intended to say. She stood 5 feet and 4 inches, but she had a way of occupying space that made her seem considerably taller. She had come to the Sumner County Territory 4 years ago with her father, a quiet, stubborn Scotsman named Donald Hurst, who had believed with his whole chest that the land could be made to yield something permanent. He had been right, though he had not lived to see much of the proving. A fever had taken him the second summer, and Augusta had stayed because leaving felt like abandoning something that still owed her a debt. She had made the ranch work. Not easily, and not without bleeding for it, but she had made it work. So when she heard the horses that October morning, she set down her grain bucket, picked up the Winchester she kept on a hook just inside the barn door, and walked out into the pale gold light to see what wanted her attention. There were 2 riders. One was a deputy she recognized from town, a thin, nervous young man named Cal Briggs who had been in Caldwell less than a year and who spent most of his time looking uncomfortable. The other she did not know. He was not a man she would have forgotten had she seen him before. He rode a dark bay gelding with the kind of easy confidence that came from having spent most of his life on horseback. He was tall in the saddle, broad through the shoulder, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved by someone who believed strongly in right angles. He wore a brown hat pushed back just slightly on his dark hair, a canvas duster the color of weathered pine, and a badge that caught the morning light and threw it back at her. His eyes, she noticed as they drew closer, were the particular blue-gray of a sky just before weather changes. He was perhaps 30, perhaps a year or 2 on either side. He looked like a man who had made some decisions he did not regret and some others that still kept him up at night. He pulled up at a respectful distance from the barn and looked at her steadily. "Miss Augusta Hurst," he said. His voice was low and even the kind of voice that did not require volume to command attention. "That is my name," she said. She did not lower the Winchester. "I am Deputy Marshal Henry Thatcher, out of the Federal Circuit. I have been sent to investigate a complaint of cattle theft filed with the Sumner County Sheriff's Office." He did not reach for his own weapon. He simply looked at her with those gray-blue eyes measuring. "The complaint names you as the party who made off with 14 head of Hereford cattle from the Dawson property 2 days past." Augusta stared at him for a full 3 seconds. Then she lowered the Winchester, not because she was afraid and not because she trusted him, but because she needed both hands to retrieve what she was about to show him. "Deputy Marshal Thatcher," she said, her voice carrying that particular edge of controlled fury that women learn when they have been doubted one too many times, "I purchased those cattle. I have the bill of sale right here." She reached into the front of her coat, drew out a folded piece of paper, and held it out at arm's length. "You are welcome to read every word of it." He swung down from the horse in one clean motion and walked toward her. He was even taller standing than he had appeared mounted, which she noted with mild irritation. He took the paper from her hand and she watched his face as he read it. She watched his expression shift from the careful blankness of a lawman conducting business to something more complicated. He read it twice. She knew because she counted. He folded it back along the original creases and held it out to her. "This is signed by Clem Dawson," he said. "It is," she said. "And witnessed by Pete Alcott." "It is." "The date is 3 days ago." "The date is 3 days ago," she confirmed. "I drove them onto this property the following morning. 2 days passed, as you noted yourself." Henry Thatcher looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not quite read. Then he looked at the barn and then back at her, and she watched something move through him that might have been embarrassment, or might have been something more layered than that. "Miss Hurst," he said carefully, "I owe you an apology. The complaint was filed by a man named Harlan Greer, who claims the cattle are his by prior arrangement with Dawson." "Harlan Greer is a liar," Augusta said, without particular heat, "the way one might state that the sky is blue." "I am beginning to suspect that may be accurate," Henry said. And then, because the apology was clearly insufficient, and because something else had entered the situation, something that had nothing to do with badges or cattle, he said quietly, "Have you eaten this morning, Miss Hurst?" "I have not, and there is a conversation I think we need to have about Harlan Greer that might go better over something warm." Augusta blinked. She had been prepared for argument or for the continued insistence of a lawman who had come to do a job and did not want to be wrong about it. She had not been prepared for that. "I have coffee on the stove," she said after a moment, "and I baked bread yesterday. It is still good." "That sounds considerably better than anything I have had since Wichita," Henry Thatcher said, and something in his expression softened in a way that made her feel, very briefly and quite against her will, like the morning was a slightly different color than it had been. She turned and walked toward the house, and after a moment she heard his footsteps and the softer sound of Cal Briggs trailing behind, and the creak of the fence as Henry Thatcher tied his horse. The kitchen of Augusta's house was small but well ordered, with a cast-iron stove that she kept going through the cool fall mornings, a table of raw pine boards she had sanded to smoothness herself, and 2 chairs. She pulled a third from against the wall for Cal Briggs, who sat down in it with the relieved expression of a man who had been waiting for someone else to take charge of a situation he didn't understand. She poured coffee without asking how they took it, because there was only one way to take coffee in that house, and that was black and strong. She set the bread on a board and put out the butter and the jar of apple preserves she had put up in September, and she sat down across from Henry Thatcher and looked at him directly. "Tell me about this complaint," she said. Henry wrapped his hands around the coffee mug, and she noticed, almost involuntarily, that his hands were large and capable-looking, marked by the same kind of work hers were, though a different variety of it. He had not removed his hat when he came in. She did not ask him to. There was a formality to the situation that still needed to be maintained. "Harlan Greer is a rancher out of the southern part of the county," Henry said. "He has been making complaints against several homesteaders in this area over the past year. Most of them have been to do with water rights and grazing land. This is the first complaint of outright theft." He paused. "He has some influence with the county sheriff. That is why the matter was referred to the federal circuit." "And you rode out here expecting to arrest me," Augusta said. "I rode out here expecting to investigate," he said. "There is a difference. In practice, there is often very little." He met her eyes at that, and she saw that he understood what she meant and that he did not dismiss it. "You are correct that the burden generally falls harder on some people than others," he said. "I will not argue with that. What I can tell you is that the evidence I have in front of me is entirely in your favor, and I intend to take this matter back to the county sheriff and make that clear." "And Harlan Greer," she said. "Filing a false complaint with the intent to dispossess someone of their lawfully purchased property is a serious matter," Henry said. He had a way of speaking about the law that was neither boastful nor mechanical. It was as if he genuinely believed in the thing he was describing, which Augusta found, she had to admit, somewhat unusual in men who carried badges. "He will file another one," she said. He has done it to the Kellermans and the widow Pace. He does not give up when the first attempt fails." Henry looked at her with more attention than she had expected. "You know his pattern." "I have lived next to it for 2 years," she said. "I have watched him push the Kellermans off a water source they legally owned. I watched him threaten Margaret Pace until she sold him land at 1/4 of its value. He operates at the edge of what can be proven, and the county sheriff has a financial interest in his success." She stopped, because she had said more than she intended, but the words had come out with their own momentum, loaded with 2 years of watching and waiting, and having no one to say any of it to. Henry Thatcher was quiet for a moment. He had eaten 2 pieces of bread with butter and apple preserves and had drunk most of his coffee, and he looked at her across the table with an expression that was considerably more complicated than the one he had arrived with. "Miss Hurst," he said, "I think you had better tell me all of it." So she did. She talked for close to an hour, and he listened in a way that she was not accustomed to, which was to say completely, without interruption, without the patronizing nod and dismiss that she had come to expect from men in positions of official authority. He asked occasional questions, sharp and specific, the kind that told her he was following every thread. Cal Briggs sat in his corner and ate 3 pieces of bread and looked faintly stunned. By the time she had finished, the morning had fully opened up, and the light coming through the kitchen window was the warm amber of mid-morning, and Augusta realized that she felt, for the first time in a long while, something that was uncomfortably close to relief. "I need to verify what you have told me against other sources," Henry said. "The statements of the Kellermans, the widow Pace, any documentation you can point me toward." "The Kellermans are still in the area," Augusta said. "Tom Kellerman is stubborn enough not to have left entirely, though Greer drove them off their original claim. They are renting land from a farmer named Whitfield about 4 miles west." She paused. "Margaret Pace sold and left. I do not know where she went. I think she went to her sister in Missouri. And the county sheriff, you said he has a financial interest." "I said I believe he has a financial interest," Augusta corrected. "I cannot prove it. I have seen Greer riding out to Sheriff Bollin's property on 3 occasions, and I have noticed that certain complaints filed against Greer disappear from the record without resolution. But I cannot sit in front of a judge and swear to the mechanism of it." Henry nodded slowly. He was quiet for a moment, and she watched him in the way she watched weather, trying to read what was coming. "I will be in Caldwell for some days," he said at last. "I am going to look into this properly. I want you to know that what you have told me will be treated seriously and not dismissed." He looked at her steadily. "And I want you to know that if Greer or anyone associated with him attempts to interfere with you or your property while I am conducting this investigation, you are to come to me directly. Do not wait for it to become something you cannot manage alone." Augusta looked at him for a long moment. She had managed alone for a long time. She was very good at it. The instruction to not manage alone was one she received from men with reliable frequency, and it usually made her want to say something precise and pointed in response. But the way he said it was not condescending. It was the way you would say it to a colleague, or to someone you considered capable but did not want to see standing alone in something that had become bigger than one person. "I appreciate that," she said, which was the honest answer. He stood and she stood, and there was a brief moment in the small kitchen where they were close enough that she was conscious of the particular warmth of another person after months of solitude. And then it passed, and they were simply 2 people who had met that morning under difficult circumstances, and found themselves in an unexpected understanding. "The bread was very good," Henry Thatcher said, and the simplicity of it made her smile before she could decide whether to. "Come back if you need anything else for the investigation," she said, which was both practically true and, she recognized as she said it, something marginally more than that. He put his hat on properly, nodded once, and walked out. She stood at the kitchen window and watched him mount his horse, watched the easy way he settled into the saddle, and she thought about the color of his eyes, which she had no particular reason to be thinking about, and then she went back out to her cattle. The days that followed were busy in the way that October always made them busy on a working ranch. Augusta had the new cattle to integrate into her existing small herd, fences to check before the cold set in, winter stores to complete, and a dozen other tasks that required her full attention. She gave them her full attention. She was good at that. But she thought about Henry Thatcher more than was strictly warranted. She thought about the way he had read the bill of sale twice. She thought about the particular quality of his listening, which had felt like a form of respect. She thought about the fact that he had asked if she was hungry, which was such a small and human thing in the middle of what should have been a confrontation, and which had somehow unspun something in her chest that she had kept carefully wound for a very long time. She did not, she told herself firmly, have time for that particular kind of thinking. Harlan Greer was a real threat, and the situation required her full faculties, not the softened ones that came from thinking about a man's eyes. 3 days later, Henry Thatcher rode back. He came alone this time, in the late afternoon, when the light was low and gold, and everything it touched looked warmer than it probably was. Augusta was working at the fence line when she heard the horse, and she turned and watched him ride up with a feeling she chose not to examine carefully. "I have spoken to Tom Kellerman," he said, reining in, "and I have been through what public records are accessible in the county office." He swung down from the horse. "I need to tell you what I found, and I think I should tell you somewhere other than on the side of a road." "Come to the house," she said. They walked up to the porch together, and she noticed that they had fallen into step beside each other with a naturalness that seemed presumptuous for two people who had met only once. She did not remark on it. She made more coffee, because it was getting on toward evening and the air was cool, and they sat on the porch in the 2 chairs she kept there, looking out over the land that was turning from gold to copper in the dying light, and Henry told her what he had found. Tom Kellerman had confirmed everything she had said about Greer's tactics, and had added several instances she had not been aware of. More significantly, Henry had found an inconsistency in the county land records that suggested a portion of land that was officially recorded as Greer's acquisition had previously been in a dispute that had been resolved in the county courthouse without a full hearing, by the signature of Sheriff Ballin, who did not have the legal authority to make such a resolution. "That is not nothing," Augusta said carefully. "It is not nothing," Henry agreed. "It is not enough by itself, but it is a thread. If I can find the original claimant of that parcel and establish that they were effectively defrauded, it opens up the question of how many other transactions went through the same mechanism." "You are describing something considerably larger than a complaint about 14 cattle," Augusta said. "I am," he said. "I want to be honest with you about that, because it means this will take longer to resolve, and it means Greer may become aware that someone is looking at him seriously, which may make him behave in ways that are less predictable." "You mean he may come at me directly?" "I mean he may increase pressure on you," Henry said. "He has reason to see you as a problem. You have documentation that defeats his complaint. If word gets around that a woman with a bill of sale sent a federal deputy away satisfied, it weakens his strategy considerably." Augusta held her coffee cup in both hands and looked out at her land. The cattle were settling for the evening in the east pasture, the 14 new ones visible among the others, their red and white hides catching the last light. She had worked so hard for every one of them. "I am not going to be pushed off this property," she said. It was not defiance exactly. It was just a statement of fact about her own nature. "No," Henry said, with what sounded like complete confidence in that assessment. "I did not imagine you were." She looked at him sideways and found him looking at her in a way that made the cool evening air feel slightly warmer than the temperature warranted. "You have been very thorough for an investigation that started as what I suspect was meant to be a quick arrest and property seizure," she said. "The job is what the job is," he said. "I do not do it halfway." "No," she said. "I do not think you do." They sat in a comfortable quiet for a while, listening to the evening sounds of the land, the cattle and the wind and the distant call of something in the tree line, and Augusta became aware, gradually, that this was the most peaceful she had felt on this porch since her father had sat in that chair and they had watched the sun go down together. She did not say that. It was too much truth for an evening that was still new between them. "I am going to need to go to Wichita to consult with the circuit judge about what I have found," Henry said eventually. "I will be gone perhaps 4 or 5 days. I want you to keep the bill of sale in a safe place, not just on your person." "I have a lockbox," she said. "Good." He paused. "Is there anyone nearby you trust in case something happens while I am gone?" She thought about it honestly. "Tom Kellerman," she said. "He has reason to want Greer held accountable and he is a reliable man." She paused. "And there is a family named Ortega 2 miles east. Louis Ortega has been a good neighbor." "I will speak to Kellerman before I leave," Henry said. "Not to ask him to guard you, but so that he knows to keep his eyes open." "That is a sensible distinction," Augusta said. He stood to go, and she walked with him to where the horse was tied at the fence post. The dark was coming down properly now, and the stars were beginning to appear, and in that particular quality of western darkness there was a closeness that didn't exist in broad daylight. "Miss Hurst," Henry said, his hand on the reins, "I want to ask you something that is not related to the investigation." "Go ahead," she said, because she could tell from his expression that he was going to say it whether she prepared herself for it or not. "When this is resolved," he said, "and I believe it will be resolved, I would like to call on you properly." He said it in the formal, careful way of the time, but his eyes were direct, and there was nothing coy about it. "Not as a lawman with business on your property. As a man who has spent the better part of 3 days thinking about a woman who showed him a bill of sale and made him the best cup of coffee he has had in years." Augusta looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved through the grass around them. Somewhere in the tree line an owl called once. "I think I would not refuse that," she said, which was the most measured way she could find to say yes, and the slight shift in his expression told her that he understood it for exactly what it was. He mounted up, tipped his hat to her, and rode into the dark. Augusta stood at the fence post for a moment longer than was strictly necessary before she went back inside, and when she sat down at the kitchen table, she found herself smiling at the cast-iron stove, which had done nothing to deserve that level of warmth from her. She put it away firmly and went to bed, and did not entirely succeed in putting it away, and admitted that fact only to herself in the dark before she slept. Henry Thatcher rode into Wichita the following afternoon and went directly to the office of Circuit Judge Amos Whitfield, a careful and thorough man of 60, with a reputation for fairness that had held up over 20 years on the bench. Henry laid out what he had found in the Sumner County records and told him about Augusta Hurst and the false complaint and Harlan Greer's pattern of operation. Judge Whitfield listened with the same quality of attention that Henry himself had learned to give, and when Henry finished, the old judge was quiet for a long time. "You are describing a coordinated scheme of land fraud operating through the mechanism of a corrupt county sheriff," he said at last. "I am describing evidence that points in that direction," Henry said carefully. "I need more." "Then get more," the judge said, "and Thatcher, be careful. Men who have been operating this way for years do not appreciate having a federal badge directed at them." "I am aware of that, sir. There is a woman in the middle of this who is particularly exposed," the judge said. "I am aware of that too," Henry said, and the judge looked at him for a moment with an expression that was not quite a smile. "Come back when you have what you need," the judge said. Henry stayed in Wichita 2 additional days, tracking down the original claimant on the disputed land parcel he had found in the county records. It took persistence, 3 trips to different offices, and a long conversation with a land agent who had retired and was now running a dry goods store, and who seemed relieved to tell someone what he knew. The man's name was Franklin Cole, and he confirmed that the disputed parcel had been acquired by Greer through a process that had bypassed the proper hearing, because Sheriff Bolin had signed off on a document that was, in Cole's careful words, of questionable legality. Henry had what he needed to take to the next level. Not everything, but enough to justify a formal inquiry. He rode back to Caldwell on a bright, cold morning, the kind of October day that made the sky look scrubbed clean, and his first stop was not the county sheriff's office. He rode out to Augusta Hurst's ranch. She was in the pasture when he arrived, moving among the cattle with the practiced ease of someone who knew each animal, checking hooves and eyes and the general health of the herd with the same methodical care she seemed to bring to everything. She looked up when she heard the horse, and something in her face changed briefly before she put it back to its usual composure. "You are back," she said, walking toward the fence. "I am back," he said, "and I have news." He had a great deal of news, and he had brought lunch, which he had picked up in town from the boarding-house cook, wrapped in cloth and packed in his saddlebag. Augusta looked at the wrapped bundle he produced with an expression that combined surprise and something that was very close to delight, though she kept it restrained. "I thought it might be presumptuous to arrive at mealtimes again and expect to be fed," he said. "It would have been presumptuous," she agreed, and then she smiled at the bundle. "But this is acceptable." They ate on the porch again, and he told her everything he had found, and she listened with that particular fierce attention she brought to information that directly concerned her survival, and when he had finished, she was quiet for a moment, working through the implications. "So there will be a formal inquiry," she said. "There will be a formal inquiry," he confirmed. "It will take some time, and in the meantime Greer cannot make any further legal moves against you without them coming under scrutiny. The false complaint has been documented and logged at the federal level. Any further complaints from him against you will be examined in that context." Augusta exhaled slowly. It was the first deep breath he had seen her take since they met. "What happens to Bolin?" she asked. "That depends on what the inquiry finds," Henry said. "If the evidence supports what I believe it does, he will be removed and likely charged. And Greer? The same if the land fraud charge can be fully established." He paused. "It may be possible to restore the Kellerman's original claim. I cannot promise it, but it is a possibility." Augusta was quiet again, and he watched the way she looked out at the land, with such a particular quality of attachment that it was almost painful to observe. He understood it in the way that people who have fought for something understand the attachment of others who have done the same. "How long have you been doing this work?" she asked. 8 years, he said. "I started as a deputy in Texas. I moved to the federal circuit 3 years ago." He paused. "It suits me better. The jurisdiction is broader. You see more of how things connect." "You like to understand the whole picture," she said. It was not a question. "I do," he said. "I find it difficult to act on a piece of something without wanting to understand what the rest of it is." "That is not how most lawmen work," she said. "No," he agreed. "It is occasionally inconvenient for the people who send me out on assignments that they expect to be straightforward." She smiled at that. He was finding that her smiles were genuinely rare and therefore worth considerably more than the common currency of smiles, and that he was becoming interested in what produced them. "Where are you from originally?" he asked. "Pennsylvania," she said. "My father came out in the early days of the Homestead Acts. I came with him." She looked at the land again. "I did not expect to stay. Then he died and I found that I could not leave, and then I found that I did not want to." "You built this yourself," he said. Not a question and not flattery. Just recognition. "I did," she said simply. "I grew up in Missouri," he said. "My father was a farmer. I was not suited to farming. I was suited to moving around and being overly interested in other people's business, which turns out to be a reasonable qualification for this line of work." She laughed at that, a short, genuine sound that he thought might be the best thing he had heard all week. "Do you have family?" she asked, and he noticed that she asked it in the careful way of someone who wants information but is conscious that the wanting might be apparent. "A brother in Missouri," he said. "He farms my father's land. We write occasionally. No wife, no children." He let the information settle naturally without pressing on it. I have an aunt in Philadelphia who writes me letters that are politely horrified by my life choices, Augusta said. No one else. Politely horrified seems like a waste of good letter writing, he said. She means well, Augusta said, though her tone suggested that meaning well covered a considerable amount of ground. She thinks I should come back east and find a husband and live somewhere with proper roads and a church within reasonable distance. And you think? Augusta looked at him with those direct green eyes. I think I have proper roads and the church in Caldwell is 14 miles, which is not unreasonable for a Sunday morning ride. She paused. And I have generally found that the suggestion that a woman needs to find a husband implies that the husband is the solution to a problem, which assumes there was a problem in the first place. That is a very well-constructed argument, Henry said. I have had several years to refine it, she said. Though you are not opposed to the institution, he said, carefully, which was probably too close to the edge of what was appropriate for a second real conversation, and he watched her face to see if he had overstepped. She looked at him for a moment. I'm not opposed to the right version of it, she said, which is a different thing from the version my aunt proposes. They looked at each other across the porch railing for a moment that lasted just a beat longer than a purely informational exchange required. I should go to town, Henry said, because he should, and because staying longer would be getting considerably ahead of where they were. I have to file the initial report and send a dispatch to Wichita. Of course, Augusta said, standing. She walked with him to the fence and he mounted up, and she stood there with her hands folded over the top rail looking up at him with the last of the afternoon light on her face, and he thought that he had ridden into approximately 400 situations in his years of doing this work, and had never once arrived at one that he wanted to leave less. Miss Hurst, he said, gathering the reins. Augusta, she said. If we are going to be in extended contact about an ongoing federal inquiry, Deputy Marshal Thatcher seems rather formal. Augusta, he said, and even just the name felt like something that fit in his mouth in a particular way. Then you should call me Henry. Ride safe, Henry, she said. He rode into town with a feeling in his chest that he had not felt in a considerable number of years, which was the feeling of something beginning. The formal inquiry into Harlan Greer and Sheriff Bolin moved at the pace of legal machinery, which was to say slowly but with a certain inexorable weight that, once set in motion, was difficult to stop. Henry Thatcher remained in Caldwell, which was unusual for a deputy marshal who typically rode a circuit that covered several counties. But Judge Whitfield had authorized an extended assignment, and Henry had his own reasons for not being in a hurry to move on. He called on Augusta in the evenings, when the day's work was done. He came the first time with more news about the inquiry, which was legitimate, and the second time with a small bag of coffee he had acquired from the general store in Caldwell, because she had mentioned that her supply was running low, which was considerably less official. She looked at the coffee, and then at him and then accepted it without comment, which he understood correctly as acceptance of considerably more than the coffee. They fell into a rhythm that suited them both. He was not a man who needed to fill silence with sound, and she was not a woman who performed ease she didn't feel. They talked when there was something to say and were quiet when there wasn't, and both of them were skilled enough readers of the world to understand that the quiet between them was increasingly comfortable in a way that meant something. Tom Kellerman came to Augusta's ranch one afternoon in early November with his wife Clara and their 2 children, and over supper Henry met them and heard more about Greer from people who had lost considerably more to the man than Augusta had yet lost. Clara Kellerman was a compact, fierce woman who had opinions she did not keep to herself, and she looked at Henry Thatcher with clear eyes that were measuring the distance between a lawman with good intentions and actual justice. The last man who came out here about Greer went back to Wichita and nothing happened, she said over the boiled beans and salt pork that Augusta had put on the table. That was 2 years ago. I am aware of that, Henry said. The agent who came out 2 years ago noted the complaint and did not follow it through the land records. I found things in the records that he apparently did not look for. Because he was not looking, Clara Kellerman said. Because he was not looking, Henry agreed. I was. Clara looked at him for another long moment and then looked at Augusta, and something passed between the two women that Henry did not try to interpret. Tom says you are going to try to get our original claim back, Clara said. I am going to try, Henry said carefully. I will not promise it. The mechanism of how it was taken is potentially reversible, but it depends on what the inquiry establishes and on whether the judge agrees with my reading of the land transfer documents. What are the chances? Tom Kellerman asked. He was a quiet, broad-shouldered man who spent his words carefully. Better than even, Henry said. I would not raise your hopes to certain, but I would not tell you it was unlikely. Tom Kellerman nodded slowly, and Clara Kellerman's expression shifted to something that was not quite hope, but was in the same neighborhood. After the Kellermans left, Augusta washed the dishes and Henry dried them, which was a domestic intimacy that neither of them commented on and both of them noticed. And when the last plate was on the shelf, he was standing close enough to her that the warmth between them was a physical presence. You were honest with them about the chances, she said. You did not make it more certain than it is. I do not find that useful, he said. People make better decisions with accurate information. Most people tell other people what they want to hear, she said. Does that work, he said. Never, she said, but it makes the telling easier. He looked at her profile as she folded the dish cloth and set it over the rack, and he thought about things he was not going to say yet, and then she turned and found him looking, and something in her expression softened in the particular way that had been becoming more common and less controlled on her part. Henry, she said. Augusta, he said. And that was all of that for the moment, because the situation was unresolved and the timing was not right, and both of them understood that. But the saying of the names was itself a communication of considerable precision. November deepened into cold, and the inquiry in Wichita ground forward. Henry filed 2 more detailed reports and rode to the county seat, once to present evidence to a state-level investigator who had been brought in to look at Sheriff Bollin's conduct. Bollin, sensing the direction of the wind, had begun making the kind of mistakes that people make when they are afraid, including a clumsy attempt to have a particular set of land records removed from the county office, which he was caught doing by the clerk, a nervous young woman named Dorothy Fane, who had the presence of mind to make a copy before she reported it. That development, Henry told Augusta when he rode back from the county seat, changed the situation considerably. Bollin is going to look for a way to deflect, he said. They were standing in the barn where Augusta had been treating one of the cattle for a minor injury to its leg, and the smell of hay and lantern oil was warm around them. He may try to direct attention back to Greer, or he may try to find something to use against the people who have given evidence. The Kellermans, Augusta said immediately. Yes, he said, and you are the reason this investigation exists. I know, she said. She was crouched by the animal, her hands steady and practiced, and she looked up at him. I have been thinking about that. What can he do at this point that would hurt us legally? Very little with the documentation you have. But Bollin is not above extra-legal pressure if he thinks it will work. Henry crouched beside her, which brought them level close. I am going to ask you something, and I want an honest answer. I generally give honest answers, she said. Do you have any other documentation here on this property that is relevant to anything Greer might contest? Water rights, fencing boundaries, anything like that, she thought. The original homestead claim, which is properly filed and registered. The water rights for the creek that runs along the north pasture, the deed for the property itself. I want to look at all of it, he said. Not because I doubt you, but because if Bollin or Greer tries something in the next few weeks, I want to know exactly what position we are in before they move. Augusta looked at him for a moment. We, she said. He met her eyes steadily. We, he said. She was quiet for a moment, and then she stood up and wiped her hands on her working apron and said, Come to the house. It is all in the lockbox. They spread the documents on the kitchen table and went through them in the lamplight, Henry reading each one carefully, while Augusta sat across from him and watched. Everything was in order, every date, every signature, every registered claim. She had, he thought, been meticulous, the way someone is meticulous when they know they are operating without the safety net of privilege and that every document is a line of defense. "This is all solid," he said, setting the last paper down. "I made sure of it," she said. He looked at her across the table, lit by the lamp, the documents spread between them, and he thought that she was possibly the most capable person he had met in 8 years of moving through a territory full of capable people, and that the way he felt about that was not simply professional admiration. "Augusta," he said. "I know," she said quietly. "I have not said anything yet." "I know what you have not said yet," she said, with the direct certainty that was entirely characteristic of her. "I have been knowing it for some time." He leaned forward, forearms on the table, and looked at her directly. And I have been knowing my own answer for nearly as long," she said, "though I find the timing somewhat inconvenient." "It is inconvenient," he agreed. "I am in the middle of an investigation on which your livelihood depends. I am not an objective party." "You were never an objective party," she said dryly. "You asked me if I was hungry within 10 minutes of meeting me." That startled a real laugh out of him, and her expression opened up into something warm and unguarded in response. "That is fair," he said. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers where it rested on the papers, and she turned her hand under his so that their fingers were interlaced, and they sat like that for a moment in the lamplight with the November wind pressing at the windows. "When this is resolved," he said. "When this is resolved," she agreed. But her hand stayed in his for a while longer, and neither of them moved to change that. The resolution of the inquiry came in stages, as resolutions in legal matters tend to, each one arriving with the particular satisfaction of a door closing properly after years of being left ajar. The first was the formal charge against Sheriff Ballin, filed by the state investigator based on the evidence of the clerk Dorothy Fane, and corroborated by Henry's documentation. Ballin was suspended from his duties pending a full hearing, which sent a visible shock through the county, because, for all that people had suspected and resented him, seeing it made official was something different. Harlan Greer's response to Ballin's suspension was to hire a lawyer from Wichita who arrived in Caldwell with an air of expensive confidence, and immediately began arguing that all the land transactions in question were entirely legitimate, and that any investigation was motivated by political interference. He was an unpleasant man, this lawyer, who wore his coat like armor, and had the particular look of someone who had made a career of making inconvenient facts disappear. Henry attended every meeting between Greer's lawyer and the county authorities, with the quiet attention of someone who has already seen the whole picture and is waiting for other people to catch up. Augusta knew about these meetings because Henry told her about them each evening, sitting on her porch with coffee, talking through the legal maneuvering in the precise, unsentimental way he had that she had come to rely on almost without noticing she was relying on it. One evening in late November he came to her porch, and she could see from the way he sat his horse that something had shifted. "What happened?" she said, before he had fully dismounted. "Greer's lawyer found the original claimant of the disputed parcel," he said, coming up the porch steps. "Franklin Cole, the land agent who retired," Augusta said, "the one you already found." "Yes," Henry said, and the corner of his mouth moved in what was almost a smile. "Cole told Greer's lawyer the same thing he told me, which is to say the truth, which Greer's lawyer apparently did not anticipate." "His own witness," Augusta said. "His own witness," Henry confirmed. "It is now on record, through Greer's own legal process, that the land transfer was improperly executed." He sat down in the second chair. "The hearing is scheduled for December the 4th. Augusta sat down beside him and took a breath of the cold air. "And the Kellerman's claim?" "Judge Whitfield has indicated that restoration of the original claim is within his authority to order if the hearing finds as expected." He paused. He has also indicated that he intends it to. Augusta looked at the horizon. The early dark of late autumn had turned the sky into shades of dark blue and fading red, and her land lay under it like something patient that had been waiting for a fair accounting. "Henry," she said. "Yes," he said. "Thank you," she said, "just that." He turned to look at her and found that her eyes were bright, not with tears exactly, but with something that lived in the same country as tears, the relief of someone who has been holding a very heavy thing for a very long time and is beginning to believe they are allowed to set it down. He took her hand, which he had been doing with increasing frequency and decreasing self-consciousness over the past weeks, and held it, and they watched the dark come down over her land. "I have been thinking," he said after a while. "About what?" she said. "About what comes after December the 4th, he said, "when the investigation is concluded and I am no longer in Caldwell on assignment." "I have been thinking about that too," she said quietly. He looked at her directly the way he had looked at her that first morning across the kitchen table. "I do not want to leave Caldwell," he said. Augusta was very still beside him. "I have spent 8 years riding a circuit," he said. "I have been good at it. I do not have complaints about the work, but I have been thinking about what I would do if the work were different, if it were located rather than circulating." He paused. "There is talk of a permanent deputy marshal position in the Caldwell district. It has not been formally opened because Ballin has been the county law and the jurisdictions have overlapped. Once Ballin is removed, there will be a gap." He paused again. "I have sent a letter to the circuit office asking to be considered." Augusta turned to look at him. "You sent that letter," she said. 2 weeks ago," he said. "Before the hearing was scheduled," she said. "Yes," he said. She studied his face for a long moment. "Henry Thatcher," she said slowly, "is it possible that you sent that letter because of me?" "It is entirely possible," he said. "It is in fact the primary reason. Though the position itself is also appealing on its own merits, and I want to be honest that the work would be real and the commitment would be genuine. But primarily because of me," she said. "Primarily because of you," he confirmed. He said it without embarrassment, with the directness she had come to expect from him on things that mattered. Augusta looked at him for a long time. The cold evening air moved around them. Inside the house, the lamp on the table made a warm square of light through the window. "I have lived on this ranch for 4 years," she said. "I have not allowed myself to think about anything beyond the next season, the next problem, the next thing that needed doing. I have been very deliberate about that." "I know," he said. "You are asking me to think beyond that," she said. "I am," he said. "Not before December the 4th, not before the hearing, but after. I am asking you to consider the possibility that beyond the ranch, beyond the next season, there might be something worth thinking about." She squeezed his hand, which she was still holding, and turned to look at the last light dying on the horizon. "I think I have been considering it for some weeks," she said, "considerably against my better judgment." "Your better judgment is quite formidable," he said with genuine warmth. "It is," she agreed. "It is why it took this long." She looked at him then, fully, with nothing held back, and he looked at her the same way. And in the cold blue evening on the porch of the ranch she had built alone, something settled between them that was larger and quieter and more permanent than anything that had been said. December the 4th arrived with a clear sky and hard frost. Augusta drove the buckboard into Caldwell and sat in the back of the county courtroom that had been temporarily established in the largest room of the hotel, because the regular courthouse was under Ballin's contested authority, and the proceedings had been moved to neutral ground at Judge Whitfield's direction. The room was packed. Tom and Clara Kellerman sat 3 seats to her left. The Ortega family was near the back. Dorothy Fane, the county clerk who had made the copy that changed everything, sat in the front row with the particular upright bearing of someone who has done a brave thing and knows it. Henry sat at the table to the right of the room's center, his reports and evidence organized with the precision she had come to associate with everything he did. He had shaved that morning and was wearing a clean shirt, and he did not look at her when she came in because he was focused on the matter before him, which was exactly right, and which she appreciated. Greer's lawyer argued for 3 hours with considerable skill and louder diminishing returns. Henry's presentation took 90 minutes and was devastating in its simplicity, because he had done the kind of thorough work that does not leave loose threads, and every document supported every other document. And Franklin Cole testified in person and answered every question with the honest directness of a man who has been carrying guilt about a thing for 2 years and is relieved to set it down. Judge Whitfield's ruling was clear and thorough. The disputed land transfer was voided. The Kellerman's original claim was restored. Harlan Greer was charged with fraud and land manipulation, charges that carried significant legal weight and would be tried in a separate proceeding. Sheriff Bolland's suspension was made permanent pending his own trial, and the false complaint against Augusta Hurst for cattle theft was formally dismissed from the record with a notation that it had been found to be maliciously filed. Augusta sat in the hotel room and heard all of this and felt something move through her that was not exactly happiness, though it was in that family. It was more like the feeling of a long-held breath finally, fully, released. Clara Kellerman leaned across the 2 people between them and took Augusta's hand and squeezed it hard. Augusta squeezed back. Afterward, outside in the cold December afternoon, with people moving around them in the particular animated way of people who have just witnessed something they will be talking about for years, Henry found her by the buckboard. He was carrying his hat, which he had removed inside, and in the cold air his breath made small clouds, and he looked at her with an expression that had dispensed entirely with professional distance. "It is over," he said. "It is over," she said. "The Kellermans get their land back," he said. "I heard," she said, and the brightness was back in her eyes. "I watched Clara Kellerman when the judge said it. I will not forget that for the rest of my life." He was standing close enough that she would have had to take a deliberate step back to put a proper formal distance between them. She did not take a step back. "The position in Caldwell," she said. "Have you heard anything?" "I received word this morning," he said. "It is mine if I want it." "And do you want it?" she said, knowing the answer. "I want it very much," he said, looking at her with a directness that made it entirely clear they were talking about more than the position. Augusta looked at him for a moment, and then she said, "Come to supper tonight. Come to the ranch." She paused. "Not for coffee and news. Come to supper because the investigation is finished and you asked to call on me properly, and I believe that was the agreement." "That was the agreement," he said, and his smile was the real, unguarded one she had seen only occasionally and which she had been finding increasingly important. 7 o'clock, she said. "I will make something worth coming for." "Augusta," he said, "everything at your table is worth coming for." She turned to climb up onto the buckboard seat because otherwise she was going to stand there smiling at him in the middle of the Caldwell Street like an entirely different version of herself than the one she had been managing for the past 4 years. And while she did not object to that version, she preferred to examine it privately first. 7 o'clock, she said from the seat, gathering the reins. He put his hat back on and looked up at her. 7 o'clock, he confirmed. She drove home through the cold afternoon and made a proper supper, which is to say she made the kind of food that required planning and time and care. A beef stew with the last of the fall vegetables, cornbread baked fresh, and an apple cake made with the preserves she had been saving for something worth using them on. Henry arrived at 5 minutes to 7, which told her what she already knew about him, that he was a man who meant what he said, and said what he meant, and did not make people wait for things they had been promised. She had set the table properly, with the good cloth she had bought in Caldwell 2 years ago, and never found an occasion worthy of it. He came in and looked at the table, and then at her, and then at the kitchen, which smelled of everything she had spent the afternoon making, and his expression was the kind that a person wears when they are in a place they had not expected to find but which feels, unmistakably, like where they are supposed to be. "This is remarkable," he said. "Sit down," she said, because she was not going to survive the evening if he kept looking at her like that while she was still standing at the stove. They ate for a long time, which is to say they ate and talked, and the talking was the kind that happens when two people have been circling the real conversation for weeks and are finally in a place where it can happen fully. He told her about growing up in Missouri, about his father and brother, about the particular restlessness that had driven him west and into law work, and about the way the restlessness had quietly settled over the past 8 weeks in a way it never had in 8 years of riding circuit. She told him about Pennsylvania, about her mother who had died when she was 12, about the relationship with her father that had been quiet and stubborn and full of unspoken communication, the way relationships between two people of the same character tend to be. About coming west and the fear that had been there under the determination, the fear she had never told anyone about because there had been no one to tell, and because naming it felt like inviting it to grow. "You have been very alone," he said, not with pity, which would have been wrong, but with recognition. "I have been alone," she said. "I chose it. I am good at it, but yes." She looked at the table and then at him. "It has been a long time since I said any of that to another person." "You can say it to me," he said. "Any of it, all of it." She looked at him across the table, the lamp between them, the apple cake half consumed, the evening fully dark outside the windows, and said, "I know." After the dishes were cleared and the lamp was burning low and it was fully late in the evening, they sat in the 2 chairs near the stove and he said, "I want to ask you something." "You asked me something once before with that exact preamble," she said. "I know," he said. "I find it serves me well." She looked at him with the slight warmth in her eyes that she had stopped trying to suppress some weeks ago. "I want to ask you," he said carefully, "what you think about a man who rides into your yard meaning to arrest you and instead ends up wanting to stay for the rest of his life." Augusta looked at him for a moment, and then she looked at the stove, and then at the window where the dark pressed against the glass, and then back at him. "I think," she said slowly, "that it is a story worth telling, though the version he came in on was fairly undignified." "The version he came in on was completely undignified," Henry agreed. "He was entirely wrong about the cattle." "He was entirely wrong about the cattle," she confirmed. "And entirely right about the coffee," he said. "The coffee is very good," she agreed. "Augusta," he said. "Henry," she said. He crossed the small space between the chairs, which was not very large but was meaningful, and he took her face in his hands, which were the careful hands of a man who had learned precision in everything he did, and she looked up at him and let everything she had been keeping managed and controlled and carefully proportioned show in her face. He kissed her with the same quality he brought to everything, which was complete and unhurried and genuine, and she kissed him back with all 4 years of solitude and work and stubbornness, and the particular loneliness of a very capable person. And outside the November wind moved over the Kansas land, and the cattle stood in the dark pasture, and everything was very still. When they drew back, he was still holding her face, and she had her hands on his chest, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "I am going to ask you to marry me," he said. "Not tonight, because the timing is still slightly too new for it to be the proper way to do it, but I am going to ask you." "I am aware of that," she said, which was her way of telling him the answer before he had asked the question. He laughed, which was a full and genuine sound in the warm kitchen, and she laughed with him, which was something she had not done in a very long time, and it felt extraordinarily good. Spring came to Sumner County with a particular extravagance, as if apologizing for the long, difficult winter. The grass came up thick and green along the creek and in the pastures, and the cattle were fat and healthy, and the Kellermans had returned to their original claim and were building back with the energetic determination of people who have been proven right after years of being told they were not. Henry Thatcher had taken up the Deputy Marshal position in Caldwell in January, operating from a small office on the main street, and had spent the winter months establishing himself in the community with the same quiet competence he brought to everything. He was, people came to find, a lawman of an unusual kind, thorough and fair, and genuinely interested in actually solving things rather than simply managing them, which was a distinction that residents of the territory had not previously had much occasion to appreciate. He asked Augusta to marry him on a Sunday afternoon in March, riding out to the ranch after church because she did not generally come to town on Sundays. He had told her once that she was the only person he could think of who had a reasonable objection to the institution, and had then proceeded to make him want to change her mind about it. And she had said that was either very good reasoning or very peculiar flattery, and she had not determined which. He asked her in the east pasture, with her cattle around them and the sky enormous overhead, which she thought afterward was the right setting for it, not in a parlor or at a supper table but out in the working heart of the thing she had built, because that was where they both actually lived. She said yes. She said it in the way she said things she meant completely, which was without elaboration, simply and directly, and he understood it as the enormous thing it was. They were married in June of 1879 in the Caldwell Church, which was a small and unpretentious building that held more people than seemed geometrically possible, because the whole of the surrounding community had developed a strong proprietary interest in the outcome of the Augusta Hurst and Henry Thatcher situation. Tom and Clara Kellerman stood up for them. Dorothy Fane came from town and cried with the enthusiasm of someone who considers herself partly responsible for the happiness in question. Luis Ortega and his family sat in the second row, and his eldest daughter scattered wildflowers along the aisle, because she had decided this was what the occasion required, and no one had the heart to argue with her. Augusta wore a dress she had ordered from the dry goods in Wichita, a deep green wool that matched her eyes and that she had altered herself to fit properly, with a collar of white cotton and her hair for once entirely unconfined, pinned only with two small combs, and falling around her shoulders in the loose auburn waves she never let it have on working days. Henry looked at her coming up the aisle with an expression that several people present described afterward as a man seeing something he had wanted badly enough to be afraid he would not get, arriving. The ceremony was conducted by the minister, a dry and decent man named Reverend Horace Cole, who kept his remarks brief and his theology practical. And when Henry Thatcher said "I do," he said it with the same directness he brought to everything that mattered to him. And when Augusta Hurst said it, she said it like a woman who had thought carefully about every word, and meant this one more than any other she had spoken. There was a celebration afterward in the large field beside the church that turned into something more extensive than anyone had planned, with food contributed by seemingly everyone in the county, and a fiddle player named Jed Maher who appeared from somewhere and played until the stars were well established overhead. Henry danced with Augusta, which she had warned him she was not skilled at, and which turned out to mean that she was self-conscious about it until she was not, which took approximately 45 seconds. And after that, they danced with a straightforward enjoyment that Clara Kellerman described as very characteristic of both of them. Augusta's aunt in Philadelphia received a letter in July describing the marriage, the ranch, the husband, the property, and the surrounding territory. The aunt wrote back a letter that was, for the first time in their correspondence, something other than politely horrified. It was, instead, grudgingly and then genuinely pleased, as if she had revised several of her assumptions in the course of writing it. Augusta read it twice, folded it carefully, and put it in the lockbox beside the bill of sale for the 14 Hereford cattle, which she kept there still. The trial of Harlan Greer took place in the fall, and resulted in a conviction on multiple counts of fraud and the unlawful manipulation of land records, with a sentence of 8 years and the forfeiture of the disputed properties. Sheriff Bolin was convicted separately of malfeasance in office and removed permanently from any position of public trust. The county got a new sheriff, a steady man named Walter Prout, who had no financial relationships with anyone he was meant to oversee, and the territory breathed somewhat easier. Henry came home from the last day of Greer's trial to find Augusta in the kitchen, which was where she often was in the evenings when the work was done, though now the kitchen was also sometimes where Henry sat with paperwork at one end of the table while she worked at the other, and they had discovered that they were both, fundamentally, people who liked that kind of parallel quiet in the presence of another person. "It is finished," he said. "I know," she said. "Tom Kellerman rode by an hour ago to tell me." "Clara," he said. "According to Tom, she sat down in the middle of the kitchen floor and cried for 15 minutes and then made a pie," Augusta said. "That sounds entirely right," Henry said. He sat down at the table and she put a cup of coffee in front of him and sat across from him, and they looked at each other across the table where they had first actually talked about Harlan Greer in the early autumn of the previous year, when he had come to arrest her and she had shown him a bill of sale, and the whole of their lives had shifted sideways into something neither of them had planned. "We should expand the herd next spring," Augusta said. "I was thinking about that," Henry said. "I want to add the north pasture to the grazing rotation. It has been lying fallow for 2 seasons and it is ready." "That would require additional fencing along the creek boundary," he said. "I know," she said. "I thought we could do it in the early spring before the grass comes up fully." She said, and it sat between them with the same quiet weight it had sat with that November evening in the barn when he had first used it, and they both recognized it and were glad. The winter that year was cold and long, and they spent it in the particular closeness that a small house and a working ranch in Kansas winter produces. Close and warm and occasionally cabin feverish in the way that 2 strong personalities inevitably produce. And they argued exactly once about the management of the feed stores, and exactly twice about whether the main room needed new shelving. And both times they resolved it with the directness that was characteristic of them both and moved on without residue. By February she was sure, and she told him in the morning before he left for town, in the kitchen over coffee, in the plain way she told him everything. He looked at her across the kitchen for a long moment with an expression she had never seen on him before, which was a form of stunned joy so complete that it seemed to briefly reduce him to something younger than he normally appeared. "Augusta," he said. "I know," she said. He came around the table and she stood, and he held her for a long time in the kitchen, which was warm from the stove and smelled of coffee, and the hay that always found its way into the house on winter mornings. And outside the Kansas land lay under its skin of snow and waited for spring. The child was born in October of 1880, which made the month, which had once meant a lawman arriving on her land with accusations she did not deserve, mean something entirely different going forward. He was a boy, solid and loud with dark hair, and the particular kind of stubborn expression that both his parents recognized immediately as familiar. They named him Donald, for Augusta's father, who had believed with his whole chest that the land could be made to yield something permanent, and had been right. Henry held his son in the low light of the bedroom, with an expression that Augusta watched from the bed, and thought she would keep for the rest of her life. The expression of a man who has been moving through the world with purpose and capability and competence for 31 years, and has found, at the end of it, the thing that all the purpose and capability and competence was apparently moving toward. Tom and Clara Kellerman came 2 days later with food and a small hand-carved horse that Tom had made from pine, and Clara held the baby and cried the way Clara did things, thoroughly and without embarrassment. And Dorothy Fane sent a gift from town, a proper wool blanket with a card that said, in her careful clerk's handwriting, that she considered herself partly responsible for this outcome too. Augusta looked at her ranch in the October light, from the bedroom window, and it had expanded in the 3 years since she had stood at the fence and watched a lawman ride up and reach for the wrong conclusion. She had added the north pasture, had grown the herd to 37 head, had repaired and extended the barn, and added a proper chicken coop, and a kitchen garden that produced enough through the summer and fall to last most of the winter. Henry had built the new shelving in the main room, which had eventually turned out to be an entirely justified improvement that she had told him with characteristic honesty, and he had accepted the acknowledgement with appropriate dignity. He was, she thought, an extraordinarily good man. Not in the uncomplicated way of stories, but in the real way, which included the slightly infuriating precision with which he organized his desk, and the way he was very bad at estimating how long conversations in town would take, and the way he sometimes woke in the night with old cases turning in his head and lay there quietly in the dark rather than disturbing her, and she always knew anyway and put her hand on his arm, and he went back to sleep. She was, he thought, looking at her from the bedroom doorway where she stood in the October light with their son in her arms, the most remarkable person he had ever met. Not in the uncomplicated way of stories either, but in the real way, which included the way she was genuinely difficult about accepting help for things she could do herself, and the way she had a particular look she got when someone was telling her something she already knew that was trying and occasionally amusing, and the way she had taken the entirety of what he felt for her and looked at it clearly and decided it was worth having. The second child came in the spring of 1882, a daughter this time, with Augusta's auburn hair and Henry's gray-blue eyes, an aesthetic combination that struck everyone who saw her as somewhat unreasonably favorable. They named her Frances, for no particular sentimental reason except that they both liked the name and it suited her, and she was a quieter baby than Donald had been, observational in the way of someone who has decided to understand the situation thoroughly before committing to a strong opinion about it. Donald, aged 1.5 years, was uncertain about Frances for approximately 4 days, and then became vigorously proprietary about her, in a way that made everyone in the household, including the cattle, slightly aware of his feelings on the subject. The Kellermans had added 2 children to their own number, and had their original property back in full working order, better in fact than before because Tom had made improvements in the years they had been away that he applied with restored energy upon return. Clara had started a small school in the territory using the Kellerman house, because there was no schoolhouse within reasonable distance and 5 children of school age in the immediate vicinity. Augusta sent Donald at 3, which was early, but Donald had opinions and expressed them, and the house was calmer with him at Clara's school for 3 mornings a week. Henry, in his 3rd year as the Caldwell District Deputy Marshal, had built a reputation for the kind of steady, thorough law work that did not generate drama but produced reliable outcomes, and the territory under his jurisdiction had a quality of order that people felt rather than saw, the way you feel the quality of a well-constructed building without necessarily noticing the individual joinery. He had also, in his 2nd year, taken on a young deputy named Ezra Marsh, a 22-year-old from a farming family in the eastern part of the county, who was serious and teachable, and reminded Henry, in his fundamental character, if not his specific presentation, of a younger version of someone trying to do the work properly. Ezra came to dinner at the ranch periodically, and was treated by Augusta with the particular form of warmth she extended to people she had decided to accept into the household, which was direct and unceremonious, and involved being fed considerably more than they had expected. He was transparently terrified of Augusta for the first 3 months, and then abruptly was not, the transition occurring at a dinner where she told him very plainly that he had made a correct decision in a recent situation, and that it had taken confidence to make it, and he looked at her as if a thing he had been worrying about had been put down, and from then on they got along well. In the late spring of 1883, Augusta received a letter from the aunt in Philadelphia. The aunt had been widowed the previous year and was, it emerged from between the careful lines of the letter, considerably lonelier than her habitual confidence suggested. Augusta read the letter twice and wrote back with an invitation, which she discussed with Henry first and which he supported without qualification, and in the summer the aunt, whose name was Marguerite, arrived in Caldwell on the stage from Wichita. Marguerite Hurst was 63, with the same direct green eyes as her niece and a manner of considerable reserve that had grown around a person of considerable warmth. The way a thorny plant sometimes grows around something soft it is protecting. She looked at the ranch and at the children and at Henry Thatcher with an appraising expression that Henry bore with equanimity, and on the third day of her visit she said to Augusta in the kitchen while Henry was in town, "He is nothing like I would have chosen for you." "No," Augusta said. "He is considerably better," Marguerite said, which was, from her, a statement of significant magnitude. "I know," Augusta said and smiled. Marguerite stayed 3 weeks, which became 4, which became 6, and at the end of 6 weeks she asked, with careful indirection, whether there might be a practical role for her in the household if she were to consider a more extended visit. Augusta looked at her with clear green eyes and said she could have the room off the kitchen if she wanted it, and that Donald would benefit from someone to argue with on more or less equal terms, which was a very Augusta way of saying yes. Marguerite moved to Kansas in the fall, bringing with her 2 trunks, a set of china that had survived 3 decades and which looked slightly bewildered to find itself in a frontier kitchen, and the accumulated practical knowledge of a woman who had run a large household for 40 years. She and Augusta established an immediate and productive working relationship based on mutual respect and the comfortable disagreement of 2 people who are very similar in temperament and know it. Henry observed all of this with quiet satisfaction and told Augusta one evening that he had not expected to have a mother-in-law, but that he found he did not object. "She likes you," Augusta said. "She expresses it by telling you exactly what she thinks, which in her case is a form of respect." "I noticed," he said, "she told me my fence line on the south quarter was wrong." "Was it wrong?" He paused. "It was slightly wrong," he admitted. Augusta's expression was entirely, eloquently, characteristic. The south fence was repaired the following week. The years moved through in the way that good years do, densely and with substance, each one building on the last with the particular satisfaction of accumulated work and love, and the ongoing daily negotiation of 2 people choosing each other not once, but continuously, in all the small and unremarkable ways that turn out to matter more than the large ones. Donald grew into a boy of the kind that a ranch produces, which is to say capable and direct and fully at home outdoors, with his father's measured quality and his mother's stubbornness in proportions that produced in him a very capable stubbornness with excellent timing. He loved the cattle with a specificity that spoke of his mother's influence, and he had, by the age of 7, opinions about herd management that he expressed with a precision that made Henry deeply amused, and that Augusta treated with the seriousness they deserved, which was occasionally considerable. Frances was her own separate entity, the observational quality of her infancy having deepened into a particular kind of attentiveness that made her see things before other people noticed them, and say them with a directness that was her mother's exactly, applied to situations her mother would not have thought to notice. She had decided at 4 that she was going to be a doctor, which in 1886 was a more complicated aspiration than it would become, and she said so to anyone who was in her vicinity, and Marguerite, who might have been expected to redirect this along more conventional lines, instead gave Frances a basic medical text she had acquired in Wichita and said she should start at the beginning. Henry watched his daughter read that book at the kitchen table with the same expression he had worn when she was born, which was the particular combination of delight and recognition of someone who has discovered an unexpected thing about someone they love. In the fall of 1885, Augusta added a 3rd expansion to the herd and took on a hired hand for the first time, a quiet man of 40 named Samuel Reed who had come to Caldwell looking for work after years of driving cattle up from Texas, and had decided he had done enough of the driving and wanted something that stayed in one place. He was excellent with cattle and taciturn in a way that suited Augusta entirely, and he lived in the small room off the barn that Henry had built in the second year of their marriage for exactly this eventual purpose. Henry had known they would need it. Augusta had said at the time it was premature. Henry had said it was not premature, it was prepared. They had both been right in their own way, which was their most common resolution. The years accumulated, and the land accumulated meaning in proportion to the work put into it, and Caldwell grew and changed around them, bringing a doctor and a proper schoolhouse and a newspaper, and all the incremental signs of a territory that was becoming something more permanent. And through all of it, the ranch on the east side of town remained what it had always been. The particular thing Augusta had made it, now shared, expanded, deeper than it had been when it was only hers. In the evenings they sat on the porch, which had been extended twice since the original 2 chairs had occupied it, and they watched the light change over the land and talked about the next season and the children and the state of the herd and the news from the paper, and sometimes about larger things that didn't have practical resolution, the state of the world, the people they knew, what things meant. Henry told her once, on a late summer evening when the children were inside with Marguerite and the ranch was very quiet, that he had been thinking about that first morning for a long time, the way he had ridden up to arrest her, and she had produced a bill of sale with the particular confidence of someone who has been right all along and knows it. "You were very irritating," he said. "I had a legitimate bill of sale," she said. "The irritating part was not the bill of sale," he said. "The irritating part was that you were entirely right, and you knew it, and you were entirely unafraid of me, despite the fact that I was a lawman arriving with the intention of arresting you." "Why was that irritating?" she said. "Because it was inconvenient for the assumptions I had arrived with," he said, "and because within about 4 minutes I had stopped being a lawman conducting an investigation and had become a man who was very interested in the outcome of a different situation entirely." Augusta looked at him with the warm expression that was his entirely, that she showed no one else in exactly that form. "4 minutes," she said. "Perhaps 3, he said honestly. She laughed, and he laughed, and the evening was around them and the land was quiet and full of cattle, and the house behind them held their children and Marguerite, and everything they had made, and Augusta Hurst, who had become Augusta Thatcher without ceasing to be any part of what she had always been, reached across and took her husband's hand. The stars were coming up over Kansas, the same extravagant western sky that had been above them since before either of them arrived, and the ranch lay under it like something built to last, which it had been, which it was, and the 2 people on the porch held the hands of a life that had begun with a bill of sale and a cup of coffee, and the entirely unexpected grace of a man who had come to arrest her and had instead asked. With the particular honesty of someone who might already be a little bit lost whether she had eaten. She had shown him the paper. He had asked if she was hungry. And everything else had followed from those 2 things, in the way that the biggest things often do, unexpectedly, logically, and with no possibility of imagining any other outcome in retrospect. Donald's voice came from inside the house, making a point to Frances about something with considerable volume, and Frances responded with the compressed precision of someone who has decided not to waste words when the right ones will do, and Marguerite said something short and authoritative that quieted both of them, and the porch was briefly very still. Augusta and Henry looked at each other. "You should check on that," he said. "So should you," she said. They went inside together, into the warm and lamplit house, and the door closed behind them, and outside the Kansas night settled over the land that had been fought for and kept, and the cattle stood in the pasture, and the stars moved overhead, and the ranch that Augusta Hurst had built alone, and then built again with someone beside her, sat on the earth like an answer to a long question, solid and present and entirely, finally, complete.